Picture this. It's February 20th, 1943. You're a German Panzer commander in North Africa, and something absolutely terrifying is happening right in front of your eyes, through your binoculars. You watch 5 American Sherman tanks moving across the desert. They're separated by hills and sand dunes, completely out of sight from each other. There's no way they can see one another. No signal flags waving, no messenger vehicles racing between them, no flares lighting up the sky, and yet they're moving like a single organism. One tank spots your position and begins flanking left. Instantly, and I mean instantly, 2 other tanks you didn't even know were there begin covering its advance from positions they couldn't possibly see. A 4th Sherman swings wide right, cutting off your escape route at the exact moment you think about retreating. The 5th tank is already calling in artillery on coordinates you haven't even moved to yet. It's like they're reading your mind, like they can see through mountains. Your hand reaches for your radio, the pride of German engineering, the G5 that cost more than a luxury car back in Berlin. You press the transmitter. Static, crackling. You can barely hear your company commander screaming orders 200 meters away. Your radio operator is frantically adjusting the dial, but every time your tank moves, every time the engine revs, every time your tracks grind against sand, the signal dissolves into noise. Meanwhile, those 5 American tank crews are having a crystal-clear conversation, like they're sitting in the same room. You don't know it yet, but you've just encountered the most decisive technological advantage of World War II. And no, I'm not talking about the atomic bomb. I'm not talking about radar or code breaking or even the Jeep. I'm talking about something far more boring. Something that sits in a metal box weighing 181 pounds. Something that German intelligence completely missed until it was way too late. I'm talking about the SCR 508 radio. And here's the crazy part. This invisible weapon didn't just help America win World War II. It literally created the blueprint for how every single modern military fights today. The German army, the force that invented modern armored warfare, the military that wrote the book on Blitzkrieg, got absolutely destroyed by a technology they thought was impossible. Let me show you how America built the world's first battlefield network, 70 years before anyone had heard of the internet. Here's what makes this story absolutely wild. Germany invented radio communication in tank warfare. I'm not exaggerating. A brilliant German general named Heinz Guderian, the architect of Blitzkrieg itself, had been screaming about the importance of radios in tanks since the 1920s. Back in 1937, he literally published a book called Achtung Panzer, where he wrote that radio communication was essential to armored operations. Not helpful, not nice to have. Essential. Guderian understood something revolutionary. Tanks moving at 30 miles per hour across chaotic battlefields needed instant communication, or they'd just be expensive metal coffins rolling around randomly. His ideas worked so well that Germany conquered Poland in 27 days and France in 6 weeks. Largely because German tank commanders could coordinate attacks through radio, while everyone else was still using flags and hand signals like it was the Napoleonic Wars. So Germany's had a massive head start, right? They invented the doctrine, they built the tanks, they understood radio was critical, and then they just stopped. By 1943, German tank production was facing a catastrophic problem that nobody in the Panzer divisions wanted to admit. Germany built approximately 5,700 medium and heavy tanks that year. You know how many G5 radio transceivers they manufactured? Less than 2,000. Let me put that in perspective. For every 3 tanks rolling off German assembly lines, only 1 was getting a radio that could both transmit and receive messages. The other tanks, they got G2 receivers if they were lucky. These radios could hear orders, but they couldn't respond, couldn't report enemy positions, couldn't call for help, couldn't warn their buddies about that American bazooka team hiding in the hedgerow 50 meters away. Imagine fighting a battle where you can hear your commander screaming at you, but you can't tell him you're being shot at. That was the reality for most German tank crews. But wait, it gets worse. Even the tanks that did have full radios were using technology that was already obsolete when the war started. The Fuji-5 was a 10-watt amplitude modulation system operating in the 27 to 33 MHz range, under perfect conditions. And I mean perfect. Flat terrain, stationary tanks, no enemy jamming. It could reach maybe 2 to 3 kilometers. But battlefields aren't perfect. When tanks started moving, when engines roared, when tracks ground through mud, when artillery started falling, that range collapsed to just a few hundred meters. And the audio quality? Forget about it. Every single electrical component in the tank generated interference. Every spark plug firing, every motor running, every piece of equipment turned the radio signal into a crackling mess of static. Tank commanders were literally shouting into microphones, hoping their platoon leader a quarter-mile away could hear a single word through the noise. Meanwhile, across the battlefield, American tank crews were having casual conversations at 10 miles like they were chatting on a phone call. July 22nd, 1941. This is the date that changed everything, and almost nobody noticed. That's when the United States Army standardized 3 radio systems: the SCR-508, SCR-528, and SCR-538 for all medium tanks. Not just command vehicles, not just company commanders, every single tank. At that moment, America was still technically at peace. Pearl Harbor was 5 months away. Most Americans thought Hitler was Europe's problem, but engineers at a company called Galvin, manufacturing later renamed Motorola, were perfecting a technology that would make German radios look like tin cans connected by string. The genius behind this technology was a guy named Edwin Armstrong, who had invented frequency modulation FM radio back in the 1930s. Now I know what you're thinking. FM radio, like the thing in my car? That's the secret weapon. Yes. And here's why it mattered. German radios used amplitude modulation, AM. AM radio works by varying the strength of the radio signal. Problem is, electrical interference also varies the strength of signals. So AM radios can't tell the difference between enemy tanks at grid reference 472 and BZZ crackle pop static. FM radio works completely differently. It varies the frequency of the signal instead of the amplitude. And here's the beautiful part. Electrical interference doesn't affect frequency. Engine noise? Doesn't matter. Artillery exploding? Crystal clear. Track grinding through gravel? Perfect audio. American tank crews could have full conversations during artillery barrages. Let that sink in. But the technical wizardry went even deeper. The SCR-508 system was a masterpiece of engineering that German designers couldn't match. Power output, 25 watts compared to Germany's 10 watts. That's 2.5 times the transmission power, which translated to nearly triple the effective range. Crystal-controlled frequency. The SCR-508 used crystal oscillators that kept the radio locked onto precise frequencies with accuracy of plus or minus 0.01%. German radios used variable capacitors that drifted constantly, forcing operators to keep adjusting the dial. By the time you finished tuning your German radio, the frequency had already drifted again. Dual receivers. The SCR-508 had 2 separate receivers. Tank commanders could monitor their platoon frequency and the company command frequency simultaneously. They could hear orders from their superiors while listening to reports from their subordinates at the same time. German commanders had to choose one or the other. 10 preset channels. American tank crews could switch between 10 different preset frequencies instantly. Need to coordinate with infantry? Switch to channel 3. Need artillery support? Channel 7. German crews had to manually dial in frequencies and hope they got it right. Integrated intercom system. The BC-606 intercom connected all 5 crew members: commander, gunner, loader, driver, and assistant driver, through noise-canceling headphones and throat microphones. Every crew member could instantly alert the commander to threats. Many German tanks didn't have intercoms at all. Crews communicated by tapping on shoulders or literally screaming over engine noise. But here's the most important specification, and it's not a technical one. Deployment rate, 100%, not 20%, not 50%, not mostly command vehicles. 100%. Every single Sherman tank that rolled out of American factories came equipped with a complete SCR-508 radio system. Every tank could receive. Every tank could transmit. Every tank could coordinate with every other tank. This wasn't just an upgrade. This was a complete revolution in how armies could fight. November 8th, 1942. Operation Torch brought American armor to North Africa, and German commanders were about to get their first taste of something they'd never encountered before. The Afrika Korps was Germany's most experienced, most elite armored force. These weren't green recruits. These were veterans who'd been fighting in the desert for over a year. They'd beaten the British repeatedly. They knew every trick, every tactic, every technique of armored warfare. And then American tanks showed up and did things that German doctrine said were literally impossible. During the Battle of Kasserine Pass in February 1943, scattered American units that had been split up during the chaotic fighting maintained perfect coordination across 50 miles of desert. Tank crews who had never met each other before were coordinating attacks, calling artillery strikes, and warning each other about threats through crystal-clear radio. Communications, German signals intelligence, units who were supposed to be among the best in the world, intercepted these transmissions and wrote absolutely baffled reports. One report from the 10th Panzer Division's intelligence section noted, American units maintain communication at ranges where German radios produce only static. More disturbing, every American tank appears capable of full transmission, not just command vehicles. Read that again. German intelligence was disturbed that Americans had put radios in all their tanks, something that Guderian had been begging Germany to do for 20 years. The German response was predictable. They assumed it was a training issue. American troops must have good radio discipline and extensive training in communication procedures. They couldn't conceive that the Americans had technology that was fundamentally superior. This misunderstanding would cost Germany the war. Let me paint you a picture of what this looked like on the ground. German tank platoon. 5 tanks. The platoon leader has a Fuji-5 transceiver. Maybe one other tank has a transceiver. The other 3 tanks have receivers only, if they have radios at all. The platoon moves in tight formation because they need visual contact to coordinate. If the command tank gets knocked out, easy to spot with its multiple antennas, the entire platoon loses coordination and basically starts fighting as individual tanks. American tank platoon. 5 tanks. All 5 tanks have full SCR-508 transceivers. They can spread out over miles and maintain perfect coordination. If the platoon leader gets knocked out, the next senior tank commander immediately takes over without any loss of communication capability. They can coordinate with infantry, artillery, air support, and neighboring tank units simultaneously. It's not even close. By September 1943, American forces were fighting in Italy's mountains, terrain that should have completely negated any radio advantage. Mountains block radio signals, right? Wrong. At least, wrong if you're using FM. The SCR-508's frequency modulation handled the multipath interference of mountain valleys far better than German AM systems. American tanks coordinated movements through terrain where visual signals were impossible, and German radios completely failed. German commanders started receiving after-action reports that described American tanks coordinating attacks across ridge lines and through valleys with precision that required, according to German doctrine, direct visual contact. But Americans weren't using visual signals. They were talking to each other as casually as if they were in the same room. The German army was fighting in the 20th century with 19th century communication methods, while America was already fighting like a 21st century network. June 6, 1944, Sherman. Tanks rolled off landing craft at Normandy beaches with SCR 508, radios that could maintain contact with naval fire support ships. Offshore, something German technology couldn't even dream of doing. But Normandy revealed both the strength and an unexpected weakness of American radio systems. The strength: American tanks could coordinate massive, complex operations across dozens of miles of French countryside. Tank battalions that had never worked together before could integrate seamlessly because they all spoke the same radio language, literally and figuratively. The weakness: tank radios couldn't talk to infantry radios. The SCR 508 operated on 20.0 to 27.9 MHz. The infantry's SCR 300 backpack radio operated on 40.0 to 48.0 MHz, completely incompatible frequencies. This became deadly in the Norman Bocage, the hedgerow country that turned into some of the war's most brutal fighting. These weren't cute little garden hedges. These were ancient earthen walls topped with dense vegetation, creating a maze of tiny fields where visibility dropped to almost zero. German infantry with Panzerfaust, anti-tank rockets, could hide in hedgerows and ambush American tanks, while American infantry 20 meters away had no way to warn the tank crews. Tanks would roll past infantry who were frantically waving and shouting, completely unaware that German troops with anti-tank weapons were in the next hedgerow. The solution came from American tankers themselves, not from engineers. They welded ammunition boxes to the outside of their tanks, installed EE-8 field telephones inside these boxes, and wired them directly to the tank's internal communication system. Now infantry could run up to a tank, grab the phone mounted in the external box, and talk directly to the tank commander through his headset. Simple, brilliant, effective. By Operation Cobra in late July 1944, this field modification had revolutionized tank infantry cooperation. German defenders found themselves facing an enemy where tanks and infantry worked together with seamless coordination that seemed almost supernatural. July 25th to 30th, 1944, Operation Cobra showcased the full devastating potential of American radio superiority. The 2nd Armored Division coordinated over 200 Sherman tanks through radio networks that gave commanders unprecedented battlefield awareness. When German defenders from Panzer Lehr Division, once Germany's premier armored training and demonstration unit, looked at their situation, they must have felt like they were fighting ghosts. American tanks seemed to have supernatural awareness of the battlefield. A German tank platoon would set up an ambush position. Before they could fire their first shot, American tanks they couldn't even see would start flanking them from directions they didn't know were accessible. German infantry would prepare defensive positions. Within minutes, American artillery would begin landing shells on their exact coordinates, called in by tank commanders who'd received reports from other tanks miles away. German counterattacks would form up in concealed staging areas. American fighter bombers would arrive within 15 minutes to destroy them, guided by forward air controllers, who'd received targeting information through the same radio network that connected every tank. The contrast with German capabilities was stark and tragic. Panzer Lehr had been reduced to what military historians call communication poverty. Most of their tanks operated without radios. They depended on visual signals, flags, flares, hand gestures, in terrain where visibility rarely exceeded 100 meters. The few functioning radios they had suffered from interference and limited range that prevented any meaningful coordination. Commanders resorted to messenger, runners, literally soldiers running, between tanks on foot under fire to relay orders. By the time messages reached their destination, the tactical situation had usually changed completely. Over 3 weeks of Operation Cobra, American forces advanced nearly 60 miles, captured tens of thousands of prisoners, and destroyed German defensive positions that should have held for months. But here's the statistic that tells the real story. The 4th Armored Division destroyed 281 German armored vehicles while losing only 41 Shermans. That's a 7-to-1 kill ratio. Remember, German tanks were technically superior. The Panther tank had better armor, a better gun, better mobility on paper. German tank crews were often more experienced. In a one-on-one duel between a Sherman and a Panther, the Panther should win almost every time. But tank warfare wasn't about one-on-one duels anymore. It was about networked operations. And in that arena, Sherman tanks with radios were absolutely dominant over Panthers without them. Here's the part that should blow your mind. Germany invented this type of warfare, then forgot their own lessons. Heinz Guderian, the man who literally wrote the book on Blitzkrieg, had been saying since the 1920s that radios were the key to armored warfare. His 1937 book, Achtung Panzer, explicitly stated, the tank commander must be able to communicate with his officers and coordinate attacks. Communication equipment is not a luxury. It is an absolute necessity. Guderian understood that rapid armor advances required reliable communication. His doctrine revolutionized warfare specifically because German tanks could coordinate in ways nobody else could in the 1930s and early 1940s. But by 1943, German tank production couldn't provide the radios that Guderian's own doctrine demanded. The statistics are devastating. German production, tanks manufactured, Heraibros 5700 FUG-5 transceivers, manufactured 2,000 radio deployment rate, Hakate 20%. Many radios went to command vehicles and assault guns. Regular tank units desperately short of equipment, 1943. American production, tanks manufactured, Sherman 18 OCR-58. Family radios manufactured, 1G11400. Radio deployment rate, 100%. Every single tank fully equipped spare radios for replacements and repairs. By 1944, the gap became even more absurd. American 1944. Production, 24,000 SCR-508 family radio sets. Total wartime production exceeded 50,000 units, all 49,324. Sherman tanks produced during the war received sophisticated radio equipment, an achievement no other nation even approached. The Soviet Union, America's ally, couldn't match this. The T-34, despite being the most produced Allied tank, typically entered combat without any radio equipment. Soviet doctrine relied on flag signals and pre-battle planning, with catastrophic results against German forces in 1941. By 1943, American Lend-Lease provided some relief, including SCR-508 radios for Soviet command tanks. But even by war's end, only about 25% of Soviet tanks carried radios. Think about that comparison. America's ally, the Soviet Union, managed to equip 1/4 of their tanks with any radio. Germany, which invented modern armored doctrine, equipped 1/5 of their tanks with full transceivers. America equipped 100% of their tanks with state-of-the-art FM systems. This wasn't just industrial superiority. This was a completely different philosophy of warfare. Let's talk about the miracle that made this possible. American industrial mobilization. Motorola's Chicago factory before the war manufactured car radios. That's it. Consumer electronics for peacetime America. Converting to military production required complete retooling and solving. Unprecedented technical challenges. Each SCR-508 system required 2,748 individual components, manufactured to exacting military specifications. The BC-604 transmitter alone contained 474 capacitors and 385 resistors. Crystal oscillators had to maintain frequency stability, despite temperature swings from African desert heat to European winter cold, despite combat vibration that could shake a tank apart. Despite the constant electrical noise from tank systems, every component had to work perfectly because tank crews' lives depended on it. The production statistics tell an incredible story. 1942. 3800 SCR-508 family. Radios produced, ramping up production. 1943 at 11 to 400 units, meeting demand for full deployment. 1944, 24,000 units, exceeding production of tanks to build replacement stocks. Total wartime production, over 50,000 complete tank radio sets. This wasn't just building radios. This was building a complete communication infrastructure that connected every American tank on every battlefield into a single coordinated fighting force. But the technical achievement went beyond just building the radios. Each radio had to be ruggedized, survive being shipped across oceans, driven across deserts, frozen in winter, roasted in summer, and subjected to constant vibration and shock. Standardized. Work perfectly with every other radio in the system, with every tank's electrical system, with every piece of auxiliary equipment. Maintainable. Simple enough that tank crews could perform basic repairs and troubleshooting in field conditions with minimal training. Reliable? Functioned correctly 99% of the time, because battlefield communication failures got people killed. American engineers solved all these problems. German engineers, despite their reputation for technical excellence, never matched this achievement. The universal deployment of radios didn't just improve American tactics, it completely transformed them. American armored doctrine developed the combat command structure. Flexible task forces organized for specific missions. A combat command might include tank battalions, armored infantry, tank destroyers, artillery, and engineers, all coordinated through compatible radio systems. American commanders could create ad hoc battle groups from different units on the fly, confident these units could coordinate effectively even if they'd never worked together before. As long as everyone had compatible radios and followed standard communication procedures, they could fight as a unified force. This flexibility completely baffled German commanders, who were accustomed to rigid organizational structures made necessary by limited communications. German units had to train together extensively to develop coordination. Breaking up units or combining forces from different commands degraded their effectiveness because they couldn't communicate efficiently. The Battle of Aricourt in September 1944 demonstrated this advantage perfectly. The 4th Armored Division faced multiple German Panzer brigades equipped with Panther tanks, superior in armor and firepower to Shermans. Germans had every technical advantage except one: communication. Every Sherman could report enemy positions instantly. Tank destroyers received targeting information from tanks they couldn't see. Artillery observers and Sherman command tanks called devastating barrages within minutes. Fighter bombers arrived to hit German staging areas before attacks could develop. Result: over 3 weeks, 4th Armored destroyed 281 German armored vehicles while losing only 41 Shermans. A 7-to-1 kill ratio that completely defied the technical specifications of the tanks involved. Throughout the war, German intelligence completely failed to understand American communication superiority. Combat reports mentioned American coordination, but German analysts attributed it to training and doctrine rather than technology. A captured September 1944 intelligence assessment stated, "American tank units demonstrate good radio discipline and coordination. This appears to result from extensive training and rigid communication procedures." The report completely missed the point. Americans weren't better trained, they had fundamentally superior technology. German tactics never adapted to American capabilities. Mistake number 1. They continued targeting supposed command tanks based on antenna configurations, not realizing every Sherman could coordinate battlefield responses. Killing an American tank commander meant another tank commander immediately took over without any loss in communication capability. Mistake. 2. They planned ambushes, assuming American tanks would lose coordination when separated by terrain. They didn't understand that radio contact maintained unit cohesion regardless of visual contact. American tanks could coordinate attacks through mountains, forests, and urban terrain, where Germans expected them to be blind. Mistake number 3. They assumed their own communication limitations applied to everyone. German planning was based on assumptions about what was possible in tank warfare. Assumptions that were completely wrong when facing an enemy with superior communications. This intelligence failure extended to the highest levels of German command. March 1945, as the capture of the Remagen Bridge demonstrated the ultimate expression of American communication superiority. When the 9th Armored Division discovered the Ludendorff Bridge intact, the only standing bridge across the Rhine. Radio. Reports reached 1st Army headquarters within minutes. Within an hour, divisions across the entire front were shifting to exploit the opportunity. German forces, dependent on telephone lines that American aircraft had systematically destroyed, couldn't respond with comparable speed. By the time German high command understood what was happening, American forces had established an unbreakable bridgehead. American radio coordination created an impenetrable defense. Tank platoons from different battalions integrated seamlessly, coordinating fires through their radio networks. German counterattacks, poorly coordinated due to communication. Failures arrived piecemeal and were destroyed in detail. April 1945, the encirclement of the Ruhr Pocket demonstrated the culmination of American communication superiority. American armored columns from 1st and 9th Armies coordinated a complex double envelopment entirely through radio communications. Inside the pocket, 325,000 German troops found themselves trapped, partly because their communications had collapsed. American fighter bombers, guided by radio-equipped forward air controllers, systematically destroyed German communication nodes. Wehrmacht units lost contact with higher headquarters and with each other. Field Marshal Walter Model's final messages before communication failure revealed the German plight. No contact with adjacent units. No communication with higher headquarters. Fighting continues, but coordination impossible. American radio superiority profoundly affected the psychological experience of tank warfare in ways that statistics can't fully capture. American tank crews fought with the knowledge they were never alone. Even when physically isolated, separated by miles of terrain with no visual contact, they remained connected through radio waves. They could hear friendly voices. They could call for help. They could warn others of danger. They knew that if they got into trouble, help was just a radio call away. German tank crews experienced the opposite: profound isolation. Unable to communicate beyond visual range, they fought individual battles within larger engagements. A German tank crew couldn't know if friendly forces were nearby, couldn't call for support, couldn't warn others about threats, couldn't coordinate with anyone they couldn't see. Otto Carius, one of Germany's most successful tank commanders, wrote in his memoir, Tigers in the Mud, about the constant challenges of limited communications. Though he focused more on tactical aspects than explicitly discussing the communication gap that American forces exploited, the psychological impact created a vicious cycle. German tanks bunched together, seeking visual contact for coordination, making themselves vulnerable to artillery and air attack. American tanks could spread out, making themselves harder to target while maintaining perfect coordination through radio. The radio superiority of Sherman tanks established principles that govern armored warfare to this day. Modern main battle tanks carry communication suites that trace their lineage directly to the SCR 508, digital rather than analog, but fundamentally based on the same principles: universal deployment, reliable coordination, information dominance. The German Bundeswehr, rebuilt in the 1950s, prioritized communications based on World War II lessons. Every Leopard tank manufactured has carried comprehensive radio systems from the start. A Bundeswehr training manual explicitly states, "The defeat of superior German tanks by inferior American vehicles with superior radios teaches that information dominance outweighs platform superiority. Modern conflicts continue to validate this." Lesson 991, Gulf War. Coalition forces with superior communications destroyed Iraqi forces. equipped with individually superior Soviet-designed tanks but inferior. Coordination. 2003, Iraq. American forces again demonstrated that network-centric warfare defeats platform-centric warfare. Modern American tanks aren't necessarily better than opponents' tanks. They're better connected. Today, the U.S. military's investment in battlefield networks, satellite communications, data links, and coordination systems all trace back to the lessons learned when Sherman tanks with radios defeated Panther tanks. Without them, the story of American Sherman tank radio superiority represents a victory in the electromagnetic spectrum that proved more decisive than advantages in armor or firepower. German tank crews fought their war partially blind to this revolution, discovering too late that every Sherman tank wasn't just a fighting vehicle, it was a node in history's first battlefield network. The SCR-508 radio transformed the M4 Sherman from an adequate medium tank into a component of a weapons system that included every other American tank on the battlefield. This transformation proved more decisive than any improvement in armor or firepower could have achieved. Every Sherman tank carried the tools of victory, not just in its 75mm gun or sloped armor, but in the 181 pounds of radio equipment that connected its crew to every other American tank crew on the battlefield. This connection created a collective intelligence that no individual German tank, regardless of superiority in armor or firepower, could match. German forces discovered this reality through bitter experience at Kasserine Pass, in Italy's mountains, across France's hedgerows, and in Germany's final battles. American tanks demonstrated coordination that German doctrine said was impossible without visual contact. The Wehrmacht never developed an effective counter because they never fully understood the technological gap. By the time German commanders understood that every Sherman tank possessed communication capabilities that most German tanks lacked, the war was effectively decided. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel's reported comment at Germany's surrender: "We knew how to build better tanks, but you knew how to make them work together," captured a fundamental truth, whether accurately quoted or apocryphal. America had built not just 49,324 Sherman tanks, but 49,324 nodes in the world's first armored battlefield network, the revolution in military, affairs that historians identify with modern network-centric. Warfare actually began in 1942, when the first Sherman tank with an SCR-508 radio entered combat. From that moment, warfare changed forever. The side with superior communications would defeat. The side with superior weapons. The network would defeat the platform. The connected would overcome the isolated. This transformation occurred largely invisible to German forces. They saw American tactical superiority, but didn't recognize its technological foundation until far too late. In the end, the electromagnetic waves carried by SCR-508 radios proved more powerful than the armor-piercing rounds fired by German 88mm guns. The ability to coordinate, to share information instantly, to fight as a unified force rather than as individual vehicles. This invisible advantage determined victory more surely than any visible superiority in armor or armament. The Sherman tank's radio superiority changed warfare forever, establishing the principle that in modern combat, connection equals survival and isolation equals defeat. German troops discovered this reality on battlefields across 3 continents, learning too late that Americans possessed not just numerical superiority, but technological superiority in the dimension that mattered most: the ability to fight as one. And that's how America won World War II with a 181-pound metal box that most people have never heard of. If you found this fascinating, hit that like button and subscribe for more hidden history that changed the world. Next week, the untold story of how American logistics, not battles, actually won the war in Europe. Trust me, it's way more interesting than it sounds.